Thank you.
It's the standard practice of this committee for the chairman to ask the nominees the following question. Do you agree without reservation to comply with any request or summons to appear and testify before any duly constituted committee of Congress if you are confirmed? Mr. Cooper?
Yes.
Mr. Hewland?
I do.
I'll reserve the remainder of my time, and at this time recognize Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank both of you gentlemen for your willingness to serve your nation in this aspect. Mr. Cooper, you're obviously from the private sector, and the private sector has certain disciplines. You know, they have to balance the budget, they go bankrupt, and then everybody loses their job. But also, in general, it should be at-will employment. The federal government doesn't have to balance its budget, which is why we're approaching $37 trillion in debt. And by and large, federal employees are immune from losing their job. So they don't show up for work, and they expect they can still continue to be employed. So you want to just quick address the imbalance there and how that impacts the effectiveness of the federal government?
Yes, thank you, Senator. Look, I agree a foundational part of any organization ultimately is accountability, as you're talking about. And that requires managers, obviously, to provide feedback and to protect individuals. But ultimately, I do think, we should look to a system where if people are performing, quite frankly, they should be rewarded and rewarded handsomely. And if people are not performing appropriately, then we need to find ways in which for them to find opportunities elsewhere.
Mr. Hewland, about 3 years ago, we were engaged in an omnibus spending debate, and I asked my colleagues, as well as the Washington Press Corps, anybody know how much we spent last year? Nobody answered. I did get one answer from the press. It was like over $1 trillion. Okay, that's discretionary spending, which is approximately 25% of total spending. The other 75% is mandatory, and we never look at it. We've gone from $4.4 trillion in 2019 to probably about $7.3 trillion this year. Completely out of control. 63% increase. Our population's growing 2.6%. I think you're well aware of the different pre-pandemic spending options I've laid on the table. What I want to talk about is a process for returning to a pre-pandemic level. We've never had a process to control federal spending. I wasn't aware of the fact that appropriation committees were initially established because of the authorizing committees were big spenders. Well, that didn't work. The Budget Act didn't work. Simpson-Bowles didn't work. The Budget Control Act did restrain just discretionary spending for a couple of years, but we weaseled around that. So, I proposed a bicameral panel, senators, House members working with OMB, to do something the private sector does all the time, a budget review meeting, and go through the 2,400 individual lines of expenditures and ask the administration to justify the spending. Compare that against, for example, fully inflated 2019 spending, or 2014 under Obama, or 1998 under Clinton. So again, you've got a lot of experience. You've seen to what extent the administration looks at the detail. We don't. Again, Congress doesn't even consider 75% of the budget, and I would argue the 25% we do is not done in a particularly professional manner. It's pretty much, well, what did we spend last year? We're going to increase it 2, 3, 4%, and then pat ourselves on the back, I guess, when we don't increase it. Wow, by the way, we're sliding discretionary spending into other mandatory. We've gone from $642 billion in other mandatory, not Social Security, Medicare, or even Medicaid, $642 billion of other mandatory to $1.3 trillion this year. So again, with short time remaining, talk to me about how we can develop a process like the private sector to go line by line through the federal budget cooperatively, the administration with Congress, so that the end result is something we can all embrace.
I appreciate your question, Senator, and absolutely, we've discussed this before, and I know you've had a chance to discuss this both with the president and the director and the deputy director. As you know, OMB, under the director and deputy director, are going through this line-by-line evaluation against a rubric of the president's campaign commitments, but as well in working to engage with you and other members of the Senate and the House about where matters stand, potential alternatives, share information and ideas, ultimately, to your point, to ensure that to the maximum extent possible, we are as unified as possible on the budget path and trajectory going forward. To your point about the amount of money being spent, one of the challenges, as you know, that has oftentimes not been as easily noticed by the press is how much of that spending is obligatory interest payment on the federal debt, which is something, again, when you joined the Senate, was much lower, around $100 billion a year, and now is $1 trillion a year. It exceeds almost any other domestic discretionary aggregate big spends, including the Department of Defense and Labor and HHS. So we have a challenge for the $36 trillion of debt that we already owe, which isn't, by the way, as you know, better than most, not the full debt, just the public debt. The debt that we owe to ourselves, you add that on top, we're at nearly $45 trillion. And so being very methodical, very careful, very clear about where to go is something that I hope there is both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue's ability to engage and work through.
So I guess I'm just asking for a commitment to continue to work with us on developing a process that actually achieves a pre-pandemic level spending. Will you do that?
Absolutely happy to commit to the process. And again, I know you've discussed directly with Director Vogt ideas about the best way to engage in that conversation.
Thank you both. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Peters.